As a real estate agent, I had seen my fair share of houses, some magnificent and others not so much. But none had prepared me for the one at the end of Willow Street. The house, an old Victorian mansion, had been up for sale for a long time. It wasn't as magnificent as it used to be. The paint was coming off, the roofs were sagging, and the windows were broken. It looked like a sad version of its past self, surrounded by tall weeds and twisted trees, casting a dark shadow on the street. I knew it would be hard to find a buyer, but I was known for taking on difficult properties. The ad mentioned there was a basement, but not much else. The owner, an old man who kept to himself and had moved to a nursing home, hadn't given much information about the house. That should have been a sign of caution. I met my clients, the Parkers, in afternoon. They were a young couple, full of excitement about the idea of buying their first home. I had shown them a few houses before, but none had interested them as much as this one. As we entered the house, there was an old smell that hit us. It was a mix of things decaying and the feeling that nobody had cared for this place in a long time. The inside of the house looked as gloomy as the outside. The wallpaper was peeling off. The furniture was covered in dust, and it just felt like nobody had been here for ages. But the Parkers didn't mind. They saw something different. Mr. Parker said we could make this place nice again, looking all determined. They went around the whole house, excited about what they could do with it. I went with them and showed them the fancy parts of the house. But when we got to the door that led to the basement, things got weird. Mr. Parker turned the doorknob, and the door opened with a squeaky sound. Cold, damp air came up from the dark space underneath. Mrs. Parker hesitated, starting to feel less excited. "It's only a basement," I told them, even though I was starting to feel uneasy too. "Lots of old houses have one." We went down a narrow, shaky staircase. The air felt thicker with each step, as if it didn't want us to go down. The dim light from the one bulb above hardly lit up the dark place. The basement was like a maze with old boxes, furniture that was falling apart, and lots of spiderwebs. The ceiling was so low that we had to bend down. Mr. Parker wasn't excited anymore. He looked more and more worried. And then we found the door. At the back of the basement, there was a door that looked very different from the others in the house. It was made of wood, with lots of fancy carvings and strange symbols that I didn't understand. The air around it felt strange, and I thought I heard a soft whispering sound coming from it. "What is this?" Mrs. Parker asked, her voice quivering. I attempted to ignore it, thinking it might be just a storage room. However, when I went to open the door, I felt a cold breeze coming from the other side. My heart raced as I turned the handle, and the door slowly opened. The room on the other side was filled with an eerie blue light. Inside, we saw strange, old objects, ancient scrolls, weird symbols on the walls, and a big fancy mirror in the middle. The mirror was strange. It didn't show the basement. Instead, it showed a dark, weird forest. It was like a window to another world. Mrs. Parker moved closer to the mirror, and her reflection seemed to blend with the forest inside it. I wanted to stop her, but it happened too fast. A strong, sudden wind pulled her into the mirror. Mr. Parker and I stood in the dark basement, trying to understand what had just happened. The soft voices around us became louder and more anxious. We didn't have a moment to hesitate. The mirror was still glowing strangely, and it seemed to be inviting us. Without saying anything, we walked through it. On the other side of the mirror, we found ourselves in a thick, dark forest. The trees were twisted and looked strange, and we felt like we were being watched by eerie, glowing eyes hiding in the shadows. But Mrs. Parker was no longer with us. She had disappeared. We walked through the dark forest for a long time, and the whispering continued in our minds. It was like it was telling us where to go, making us go further into the woods. We didn't have another option, so we kept walking. As we walked further, the forest got weirder. The trees looked all twisted and strange, and the ground felt bumpy, like it was breathing slowly. It got colder, and I understood that we were in a place where time didn't work like it should. And then, we found her. Mrs. Parker stood in front of a huge, very old tree with her back to us. She was saying strange words over and over again in a dull, unchanging voice. It seemed like the tree was listening to her words, and its rough surface was moving strangely, like it was alive. We called out to her, but she didn't respond. Ultimately, we had to leave her behind and go back to the basement. The strange glowing mirror was still there, and we walked through it, ending up back in the dark basement. The whispering had stopped, and the air felt heavy with silence. The Parkers didn't purchase the house, and I never sold it to anyone else. I couldn't forget what we saw in that basement. It was a strange place where time and reality got mixed up, where things from the past and present seemed to happen at once, and where it was hard to tell who was alive and who wasn't. I quit my job after that.
I was a part-time pizza delivery guy, doing it to help pay for college. Most nights were pretty routine, but one night was different. It was a dark and stormy evening when my ordinary job turned into a spooky adventure that I'll never forget. The rain was pouring down hard, making it the kind of night when everyone preferred to stay inside. But the pizza place I worked for had a rule. We delivered no matter the weather. This time, I had to deliver to an address I'd never been to before. It was a house hidden deep in the woods. It felt like I was driving into the middle of nowhere. The rain made the drive tough. As I drove along the winding roads, it felt like the trees were closing in on me, blocking out the moonlight. All I could hear was the sound of rain on my car and occasional thunder. Finally, I reached the address. The house looked old and worn down, with paint peeling and a roof that sagged. The porch light was flickering, making eerie shadows on the untidy front yard. I took the pizza box and went up to the front door, my heart racing. I rang the doorbell and waited, getting drenched in the rain. After what felt like a very long time, the door opened. An old lady stood there. Her hair was a mess and her eyes looked cloudy with age. She stared at me like she hadn't seen another person in years. "I've got your pizza," I said, handing her the box. She took it from me and said, "Thanks, dear. Why don't you come in? It's so cold out there." I thought about it, looking back at my car. The rain wasn't stopping, and I was soaked through. The idea of going into a warm, dry house was appealing. I followed her inside. The living room was dimly lit. It was a mess, with old furniture and cobwebs all around. The air had a musty smell. I sat on the old couch, and she placed the pizza box on a wobbly table. She didn't open it, just stared at it as if it held some special meaning. "Are you all alone here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She turned to me, her cloudy eyes locked onto mine. "I've been alone for a very long time," she replied mysteriously. The room became very quiet. I shifted in my seat, minutes feeling like hours. Just when I thought I'd make an excuse to leave, I heard it. A faint, sad cry coming from somewhere inside the house. I jumped up, my heart racing. I asked, "Did you hear that?" The old woman took a step closer, her cloudy eyes filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. And she said, "You've heard it." With a slow, deliberate movement, the old woman reached out and touched my hand. "You were brought here for a reason," she whispered. Before I could react, the room plunged into darkness. The power had gone out, leaving us in pitch-black silence. I could feel her presence nearby, but I couldn't see anything. Then, the cry came again, louder and more agonized than before. It was as if it was right in the room with us. In the darkness, I felt a cold, bony hand grasp my wrist with an iron grip. "Listen carefully," the old woman hissed. "You must help them find peace." Before I could respond, the lights flickered back on and I was alone in the room. The pizza box sat on the table, untouched. Terrified and bewildered, I ran out of the house and back to my car. I sped away from that accursed place, my heart pounding in my chest. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of that night, but it haunts me still. The cry, the old woman's words, and the darkness, all of it remains etched in my memory. I never went back to that house, and I quit my pizza delivery job soon after. But I can't escape the feeling that I was brought there for a purpose, that I have a role to play in helping those lost souls find peace.
The wind outside my small cabin was strong, shaking the windows. I was wrapped up in a warm blanket, trying to stay warm. It was a very cold night, and I was alone in the woods. I came here to be alone and away from the city's noise. But as I lay there, I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. Late at night, I heard something strange, a soft sound like people talking, but I couldn't understand the words. I thought it was just my imagination because I was alone in the quiet forest. But the sound didn't stop. It got louder and louder. It was like many people talking at the same time, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. I got out of bed and looked out of the window. The forest was very dark, and I couldn't see anything. There was no one around to make those strange sounds. I went back to bed, but the talking continued, and I still couldn't understand it. I couldn't take it anymore. I got a flashlight and went outside to find out where the sound was coming from. The forest was very dark and the trees were big and silent. As I walked deeper into the woods, the talking seemed to come from all around me. It was like it was following me, and I couldn't get away from it. I found a clear space in the woods with a strange blue light. In the middle of the space, there were big rocks with strange marks on them. In the middle was a tall, shiny black rock. The talking was coming from the black rock, and it got louder when I touched it. The marks on the rock started to move. The talking was saying, "Join us and you will be free." It was like they wanted me to do something. I touched the rock, and the talking got even louder. I felt like I was burning. I pulled my hand away and stepped back. I heard a humming sound, like a song, coming from deeper in the woods. I followed it, and it led me to a group of people standing in a circle. They were wearing old clothes and they had hoods on their heads. In the middle was a woman who was swaying and singing. The people in the circle raised their arms and sang, "Join us, and you will be free." Their voices were like music, and I couldn't resist. I ran away, scared of what I had seen. I locked myself in my cabin and tried to forget about the talking, but it stayed with me all night. In the morning, I packed my things and left the cabin. I didn't want to stay in the forest anymore. It had strange secrets, and I didn't want to know them. As I drove away, I wondered about the woman in the circle. What happened to her? What happened to the others? I didn't have answers, and I didn't want them. Some things are better left alone, and the forest had shown me that. It had told me its secrets, and I didn't want to hear them again.